Hello friends! It is almost October. We are talking about horrifying female monsters this week. Welcome to my favorite unit of this class.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Okay, in all seriousness, horror has been a super important genre for feminist criticism and feminist cultural critique because so much of it so obviously hinges around social anxieties about sex and gender. Gothic novels of the late 18th and 19th centuries invented the trope of the vulnerable female heroine done in by psychological weakness and nervous sensitivity. The 19th century religion of spiritualism that took hold in America and Europe between 1848 and the 1920s, think seances and Ouija boards and spirit photography, centered women as spiritual mediums because women's bodies were thought to be more sensitive to contact with the other side. Slasher movies beginning in the 1970s wrote fear and terror onto vulnerable female bodies in ways that were exploitative, but which also centered female protagonists as survivors and showed them defeating monsters and killers. Its iconography, tropes, narrative devices, and cinematic codes can thus all be interpreted through the lens of gendered difference. The goal today is to move through some new ways of thinking about horror as a genre, both literary and cinematic, in relation to ideologies of gender and difference. We'll then keep those things in mind while reading the intro to Sadie Doyle's Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers and how it applies to the film for this week, Robert Eggers' The Witch from 2015. As a genre, horror has a few different literary and cultural roots that shape what we see in its novels, films, and short stories today. The first, which I already mentioned, is the Gothic, which was a literary genre that became really popular in the 1790s and throughout the 18th century and even today. It emerged around the same time as Romanticism, which was an artistic, literary, and philosophical movement that sought a pleasurable kind of fear called the sublime. Gothic fiction also emphasizes pleasurable fear and does so by evoking spooky moods through a combination of imagery, setting, and perspective or point of view. Think of mostly empty manor houses on the English moors, the sounds of wind in the eaves and dogs barking in the distance, candles barely lighting your way through enormous empty houses. Maybe there are ghosts, or maybe it's all in your imagination. The Gothic is the root of our haunted house stories, and as it became more violent in the 19th century, our slasher movies and monster stories as well. A popular form of cheap, sensational entertainment came in the 19th century in the form of penny dreadfuls, which cost only a penny, hence the name, and told serialized stories about murder, criminals, or supernatural entities. They were the UK precursors to American pulp magazines, which I'll get to in a minute. Here's an image of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, murdering one of his victims in The String of Pearls, which was published between 1846 and 47. Or Varney the Vampire, which helped inspire one of the most famous horror novels of all time, Bram Stoker's Dracula, a few decades later in 1897. Toward the end of the Victorian era, pulp magazines became popular in both the UK and the US. Many of these were aimed at young boys, telling adventure stories about mysterious and far-off lands, where explorers encountered monsters, beautiful women, and all kinds of exoticized cultural differences. These stories were rooted in colonialism and were, perhaps unsurprisingly, virulently racist and misogynistic. In America, Edgar Allan Poe borrowed from the Gothic for his stories, but he also became the father of detective fiction, which was another popular genre of these pulps. Through these cheap magazines in the early 20th century, publications were playing with and eventually solidifying different popular genres: romance, detective or mystery stories, science fiction, westerns, and horror. One of the strange melting pots of genre in this time was a publication called Weird Tales, which ran from 1923 to the 1950s. Weird Tales combined racist colonial adventure stories with supernatural fiction, lots of werewolves, vampires, and spiritualists, with what came to be known as science fiction. It was a mishmash of science and magic and cosmic curiosity. Its most famous author was H.P. Lovecraft, whose legendary mythos has remained popular and has even seen a major resurgence of popularity in the last 10 years or so. But Lovecraft, like many of these pulp authors, was openly and incredibly racist. He wasn't much of a fan of women and their sexuality either. Weird fiction like Lovecraft's is contemporary horror's other root, and it differs from the Gothic. It's less psychological, less emotional, and more about rationality confronting what it can't explain. Now, all of this is some background info to help us think about the ideological roots of horror, particularly as they pertain to race and gender. Where do our monsters come from? Where does our fear come from? What we fear and reject, what we write stories about defeating over and over again, can tell us a lot about what we value and what we believe in. Let's take, for example, the Gothic heroine, who is at the root of so many horror protagonists. The Gothic heroine is the main character of a psychological story of mystery. She usually enters a new place and discovers that it has secrets. She's usually young, almost always white, and is often psychologically vulnerable. She experiences things which may or may not be supernatural in a strange or unfamiliar setting, often a large house. In traditional stories, she is a virgin, often signified by blonde hair, sometimes white dresses or nightgowns. The most famous American literary Gothic heroine is probably Eleanor Vance from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, published in 1959. But there are many, many Gothic heroines throughout American literature and film. This heroine has literary and mythological roots in the damsel in distress trope, but the difference here is that she's a protagonist and the story is told from her perspective. She is the prototypical white woman in trouble that Scary Movie so hilariously made fun of in 2000. In the slasher films of the 20th century, the Gothic heroine transforms into what Carol Clover called the final girl in her famous book about gender and horror, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. The final girl is the virginal protagonist who symbolically reclaims phallic power, usually the slasher's knife, in order to defeat the monster and re-enter society. The concept of the Scream Queen has become essential to the genre of horror, bound up with the cultural narrative of white women's vulnerability and need of protection. At the same time, she is sexualized and objectified, and then put in danger in order to create a spectacle of her vulnerability and sexuality, and then finally mutilated or otherwise killed. Unless, of course, she happens to be the virginal and redemptive final girl whose body experiences and expresses the horror in a spectacle for the audience. The white female victim performs a neat trick of simultaneously valorizing whiteness and punishing femininity, a trick that's been in use since at least the 19th century penny dreadfuls and the adventure pulps. Where the white woman is the victim in much of Gothic horror, the monster is often racialized, and again, this stems from the racist adventure pulps of the Victorian era. Or his masculinity is hindered in some way, by a controlling mother or by his own failure to be properly masculine. But not all monsters are so easy to pin down, so let's talk about the monster. The word monster comes from the Latin monstrum, meaning divine omen, portent, sign, and which comes from the same base as monere, meaning to warn. The word monster is, quite literally, a term of signification. It means meaning. Monsters are meant to be interpreted. They are most often understood as indicating border anxieties between human and non-human, alive and dead, self and other. They appear as manifestations of the horror that emerges from crossing or dissolving these boundaries. Where one thing ends and another begins reside often fuzzy, malleable, or porous distinctions, sometimes made literal in hybrid creatures. The sometimes uncertain border between life and death gives rise to the zombie and the vampire, as well as to reproductive monsters, the mother destroyer, the demonic offspring, or the moment when the alien explodes out of John Hurt's chest. The grotesque, monstrous body has a long history of representation in literature and film. In the Gothic tradition, it is often associated with diseased, disabled, or racialized bodies. This association continues in the tradition of weird fiction, with its frequent fixation on hybridity and degeneration, in which the monstrous body is not only physically dangerous, but also socially threatening. The monster represents a threat to the very order of things by undermining the stability of the world's governing logics, like science and rationality. As Sadie Doyle points out in her book, there is a long tradition of understanding women's bodies as already monstrous. Male was the norm, the standard of the body, whereas female bodies were aberrations, monstrosities. Much early scholarship on gender and horror focused on the female as victim in the Gothic tradition. However, based on the work of Julia Kristeva in Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection in 1980, some scholars began focusing on female monstrosity. One of the most influential of these was Barbara Creed, whose book The Monstrous Feminine: Film, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis was published in 1993. Creed, through Kristeva's psychoanalytic theory of horror, argues that the female reproductive body is the source of great social anxiety, and thus many of our monsters on film. Sadie Doyle follows this reasoning and, like Laura Mulvey, uses the structure of patriarchy to diagnose our cultural representations of female monstrosity. Sadie Doyle, Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Monstrosity, Patriarchy, and the Fear of Female Power, published in 2019. If patriarchy operates like the structure of a nuclear family, writ more broadly onto the structure of society, we can see how men, women, and children are prescribed specific roles. When women fail to properly meet the expectations for those roles, when they deviate, they become monstrous. Horror, as a genre, is one place where that monstrosity becomes literal. We can read female monsters, then, as a diagnosis of patriarchy's anxieties. Doyle's introduction is short and really easy to read, so I won't walk through it here, but I want to mention that the chapters of her book are structured around these different roles that are prescribed to women and girls, and the ways that their perversions become monstrous in our cultural narratives. The first part, Daughters, is broken into 2 chapters on puberty and virginity, both of which are central to the representations of gender in horror. Why are pubescent girls so scary? Why are they at the center of our most terrifying cultural narratives? Why are we so afraid that they'll become possessed, become witches, use their bodies and their virginity to obtain dangerous powers? Keep these questions in mind for Thursday and as you watch this week's movie. The film The Witch is about a nuclear family and about a pubescent girl. Think about how the patriarchal structure of the family in this film is under threat, how it collapses, and how the teenage girl bears the brunt of the blame. While early Gothic tales and weird fiction were often considered reactionary and conservative, there is also a long tradition of feminist horror that critiques patriarchal structures rather than trying to uphold them. There are also ways of reading what appear to be reactionary stories against their own logic. There are so many different ways to interpret a story and to interpret a monster, so keep that in mind too while you're watching the film. How are some of the different ways that we might interpret this? In Thursday's meeting, we'll do just this, so I'll break you up into smaller groups again to talk about the film and the introduction to Doyle's book, and then we'll come back together and hopefully have a really productive discussion. So I hope that you've learned some new things today and that you found some of the stuff interesting and that you'll be able to apply it to the film this week. Happy reading and watching. Turn the lights on if you need to, and I will see you Thursday.